Hello, everyone. I'm Rabbi Jill Hammer, and welcome to the Mystics Room here at Beit Kohenet. Today, I have the honor to get to speak with Rabbi Dr. Alan Brill, who teaches at Seton Hall and who's written a number of books, including Thinking God, the Intellectual Mysticism of Rabbi Tzadok HaKohen, Rabbi on the Ganges, a book about Jewish-Hindu encounters, a book on Judaism and other religions, and a forthcoming book on Jewish views of the Trinity. Alan, you've delved for a long time in this, in the field of religion and spirituality and comparing different spiritual traditions. I'm really excited to get to talk to you today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay. So I've encountered your work in a variety of different environments. And one of the most memorable for me was sitting in a session with you at the Academy for Jewish Religion, where you were speaking about the different spiritual leadership opportunities in sort of early Hasidism, and I was riveted. So I wonder if you might say something about what got you interested in Hasidism, and is that something that has carried over for you into your interest in interfaith work?
Okay. So I got interested in Hasidism as in some way applied mysticism. I want to come back to mysticism later in this talk. But in some way, I was always riveted less by Kabbalah as a formal academic, like let's, identify this text, but as a direct mystical experience. I wound up doing my doctorate, finishing my doctorate at Fordham University in a mysticism program. So in terms of comparative mysticism, and that was really my focus. And Hasidism became a way of dealing with a direct experiential approach. At this point, I would have probably, if you had asked me now, written on something more in Kabbalah directly, because since I've now actually done things like spoken at the Tantra Institute in New Delhi, comparing Kabbalah to Tantra, I understand a different way how to read the text to see the mysticism in it, the same way the Hindus are taking text from the year 1000 or 1300, and how do they read it to produce what the gurus and swamis are teaching. So anyway, so that's why I got started in Hasidism. I wound up um, taking courses in Hasidism with visiting Israeli professors. I studied it. I went off to Israel to study it. And Hasidism became something you could point to specifically because it's already written in a semi-modern style, and already a style with, oh, we did this, we did that, which you don't find in a medieval text.
Mm. It'd be great if you would say a little more about applied mysticism. Beit Kohenet identifies as a house of earth-based feminist mystical Jewish seeking, and I'm curious about how you understand, applied practical mysticism.
So I'm going to start on the second word.
Yeah.
Mysticism is a term that came to be at the turn of the 20th century with heavy Protestant tones from Quakerism, from William James, as if it's a unified point. If you open up, even the introduction to the Zohar, we have encounters with Elijah, dream sequences, we have visions, we have all sorts of sense of communion with different levels of the divine. You go to Safed and you've got a gallery of dozens of different types of experiences, from mystical, tantric, shamanic, all found in let's say the greater Safed literature. I really don't like. I mean, mysticism. We keep thinking, oh, it's one thing. No, there are so many different experience. I mean, the experience of, let's say, Cordovero going out, basically wandering in the woods and then feeling the Shekhinah coming through him is very different than a Lurianic visualization of the letters in which you're now combining letters. It's very different than a more, bhakti, Sufi singing of poetry of Zikri. So I personally, dealing with the word mysticism, I would want us to be much more specific, more experiential, and learn to stop identifying it with theosophic corpuses that specifically deal with ancient traditions of interdivine realms, angels, cosmology. It's related, but it's not the same. It's not the same.
Hmm.
Uh, they're overlapping, but they're not identical. If we're talking about mystical experiences, then let's read the experience. Let's read the text that way, which is very different than saying we're going to now do this kabbalistic text.
Hmm.
So now it's applied. Getting to your word applied is I do think we've got to look at these and read this. What does this mean in an applied way? This actually came out strongest. I always felt this, but it came out strongest when I learned about the Hindu applied mysticism. So if you look at somebody like Swami Vivekananda, who got up there and taught all these meditation techniques, Raja Yoga, which then became used by all the later Swamis, you look at the texts that he cites, that he's basing himself on, and there are things like the Korma Purana from antiquity that reads as obscure as a Sefer Yetzirah, reads as obscure as a Sode Razaya. And what he did is took them and explained it in a way of how to do it, took out pieces of the metaphysics that were just beyond our way of thinking, because sometimes late antiquity cosmologies are just not where we're at, really took it out and then said, go visualize this as a yogic meditation practice. What Swami Vivekananda did is similar to what R.A. Kaplan started doing, and is similar to some things you're doing. And it becomes this process of not to get to learn that you're not giving a class in 10th century text. You're learning about how to understand it um, as a mystical practice. Almost like I don't like the word mystical. I actually would separate out and use, let's say, to use the Hindu words, yogic, tantric, bhakti are
Hmm.
all different types of practices. If my goal is to be a Sufi thikr or a bhakti, let's dance and sing and play drums. It's a different activity than let's meditate on a focus point to gain a single act of attention.
Hmm. Hmm. So you're really kind of diversifying this field of mysticism for us. And instead of throwing it all into one bucket of uh, theoretical and practical and all kinds of
That's right.
different.
We would gain a lot by understanding what we're doing, and it would also be a greater sense of legitimization, because sometimes people are very, is this legitimate? Is it not legitimate? But that's not what it meant in the 13th century. Buddhists and Hindus are not caring what they said in the 13th century. The entire field of mindfulness practice and Vipassana practice was, started a little over 100 years ago, and the current forms only exist in my lifetime.
Wow. Wow. Would you say this is a hermeneutic when you go back to these texts and what you're looking for is what people's underlying experiences might have been? Like when you read a Zohar text about the appearance of Elijah and you imagine, right, this is an experience that people were having. Is that a particular way of reading these sources?
It is a particular way of reading it. I do think that what's the name? River Flows from Eden by Malila um,
Helner Eshed, yeah.
Aisha already is starting that process. She focused on only certain parts within it,
Mm,
and she creates the three levels, which is I get to use that section of her book where she creates the three levels of the mystical experience in Gufa Zohar, and apply it to Catholic texts. And my Catholic students love it because it allows them to articulate. There's a difference, like because actually go in retreats and use Catholic mystical texts, but they understand that at the retreat they're only reaching this level and not reaching that level. So they actually like her book, but she now didn't deal with, for example, lots of other parts and lots of experiences that are in this corpus.
Mm. Would you say that some of this was lost for a while, or that, the practical exploration of these things is coming back into being, or is it just that it's it hasn't been in the liberal area of the Jewish world until recently?
Oh, several answers. One, I don't buy the sense that everybody used to do it in Eastern Europe and everybody knew it and it was there. That sort of mythic past
Hmm.
theory. It was always an exclusive for a certain group who was interested in it and who did it, and that was always there. I do think that modern Jews, especially American Jews, really threw it overboard on the way to America because
Hmm.
they're going to be modern, scientific, rational. Anybody who would describe anything in Judaism, I could, put a gallery of people: Solomon Schechter, Mordecai Kaplan, um, Herman Cohen, Leo Beck. None of them cared about this material. So almost all the modern presentations left it out, even if it came back with the counterculture in the uh, 60s. So in that sense, it's being reclaimed. As a practical level, it's being reclaimed even more. But on the other hand, with all those caveats that there was no golden age and it was completely thrown out overboard, there is the element that, I open up a traditional text like the Mishnah Berurah, the halachic text of the Chafetz Chaim from the turn of the 20th century, and the first chapter says when you come to the synagogue, you should visualize the divine name
Hmm.
in an Aryeh Kaplan way.
Hmm.
The fact that that's already in the very first chapter means it's there. Old prayer books include it, or Sephardic prayer books will include it in their introductions or in the margins. Not that everybody was doing it, but there was a certain understanding that some people were doing it. I mean, one story that I like to tell is the story of Lillenblum, who is a very famous maskil from the 1860s, lived in White Russia.
Would you just say what maskil is for our listeners?
Maskil is one of those enlightened figures who left the traditional path and wanted in some way become a modern Jew, usually a rationalist German culture seeking modern Jew. But he started as Chabad. So he wrote an autobiography called Chatat Nurai, The Sins of My Youth, where he's got a section there saying, I went to synagogue on the holiday of Rosh Hashanah, and I spent the entire holiday visualizing the divine name. I was in ecstasy. I was connected to the divine. I couldn't have had a better service. But then in the middle, I started questioning, is there a God? Can you prove there's a God? The, what about all the stuff of Western philosophy I've read? They say there is no God, and therefore I lost my practice. And then he says, 2 years later, I went back to the synagogue and I said I wanted to do the same thing to experience the divine. But he said, now I couldn't. Now that I no longer believe in the divine, I can't do the practices. I can't do the visualizations anymore. And then he goes on, he describes his entire loss of faith there and loss of practice. So here we see an ordinary, real figure who was trying to do these things. The modern era made him lose it. He couldn't go back to it. And now we're coming back to it once again. But we're already doing it. When we come back to it now, not only are we influenced by various tsunamis and counterculture of the 60s, if you're coming in the 21st century, you're influenced by both Buddhist mindfulness and Vipassana in your language, and you're influenced by now the psychedelic turn that's been going on the last few years.
Hmm.
Uh, to psychotropic drugs as part of the spiritual experience, and it becomes a natural way of a relanguaging.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I hear it. Earlier you mentioned Cordovero going into the woods, right? And the Baal Shem Tov also, went into the woods. So how does experience of the natural world play into this? Play into these traditions of experience of spiritual experience.
So I'm not sure they had, nature with a capital N the way we use it in the romantic sense.
Mm,
But there was a sense of communing with the natural order, getting out of the realm of civilization, of humanity, of going into a pristine place. There was a sense within these traditions of the language of the birds and the language of the animals and being out there. There were certain shamanic elements of animal metaphors and all sorts of um, ways to think about a animate reality around you. They had no problem with a certain amount of nature. Um, nature is infused with the divine.
mm,
And beyond that, there was the general immanence in which nothing is devoid of the divine. The divine is in everything, which played a role also. Um, but I think the biggest thing is really to get out of all the noise of civilization and then commune in some way with listening to what's around you.
mm, mhm. So in a sense, stepping out of one's social role.
And so, well, but at the same time, since you assume this semi-animism,
Hmm.
this semi divine in all things,
Yeah.
I mean, listening to the birds is important. I mean, I'll give you a story. I mean, I spent the summer teaching in Indonesia, and the religion of Indonesia and Java is Sufism, but it's a very animate, you know, um, Islam Sufism that includes Hindu, Buddhist, animist elements,
Mm,
and there was a very clear sense of their practice was nothing like you think of Islam as Sunni law, is very much as communion on graves in the natural order in the woods
mm,
with sacred objects. And and you saw that in practice. And they had a whole language of divine energies that are within objects. You may have known that back in whatever the 80s, part of this Sufi, Indonesian Sufi animism came to America subud as a certain spiritual practice to channel the energy. Um,
mm.
so I see it that it's a really there if you really open yourself up to thinking about the text and the terms. Now, they are not, and this is important, going back to ask whether their continuous practice of naturalistic Sufi Islam is the same as what Al Razali or Ibn Arabi meant directly.
Right.
You see that that's not their question. It's certainly the question in an academic Jewish studies program, but I taught in graduate school in Indonesia. And even in the graduate school, which had a much more sociological, experiential level than we have in the West, I taught comparative mysticism. The comparative mysticism was not completely what it meant just in the text, but is what does it mean as a text? The way we read literature, for
Mm,
example, we
mm.
don't read Shakespeare to ask exactly what it meant in the 16th century.
Right. 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 Would you make any sort of parallel between that kind of animist Sufism that you encountered and something that was happening in the Jewish world?
Oh, I certainly see it in many figures within Jewish tradition. I'm not sure they've all been culled. We don't exactly cull it out and do it in that form. Maybe you'll do it, but there are certain many figures that do go in that direction. Who have that strong. I don't know what word. animist shamanic element to them
Mm.
within what they do. And whether it's medieval or it's in Sapphic or in Hasidism, you do have those figures um,
Yeah.
that are out there.
Hmm. Does it make sense to ask for an example, or I mean, like, would Isaac Luria be an example, or would you?
An example I gave because I once wrote about it was the uh, Rabbi Ephraim, the Degel Machane Ephraim.
Hmm.
He clearly has strong elements of um, the language of the birds and the trees and the power of the snake and going into trance
Hmm.
from his pipe. Um, that clearly fits into that category. An article I wrote like 25 years ago because the field, the field was in a very different place then. And um, who else would you think of that would fit that sort of? Now, Luria, despite all the legends, was a much more bookish character. I mean, his connection was much more communion with the saints.
Hmm.
And what he did when he got to Sapphic was identify all the graves in the Sapphic region.
Right, right,
And
right.
then it created how you commune with the saints and going to the graves to pray. That's really one of the traditions he started. So it does fit into all of this. And we're going back to my Sufis in Indonesia. I went with them at midnight to go to Sufi graves. Um, you
Wow.
know, to go watch what they were doing and to be part of the action. But at the same time, in Indonesia, the Sufi graves would also have little shrines to the rather, you know, uh, animist goddess of the ocean,
Hmm. Wow.
which doesn't fit into Islam in any way, shape, or form, but it was there.
There's shape.
Um,
Yeah, that's great. You're talking about the practice of visiting graves, and I'm thinking of some of the research, for example, of Annie Cohen, who's been looking at the practices of women who are measuring graves, right, who are taking people to graves and speaking to the dead. I guess I'd love to hear a little bit about some of your gender observations regarding to whom was this practice accessible, or how might it have differed according to gender.
so starting because I'm going to start with women because I don't know if there's a really good study that's been done. I mean, there's observations because we keep looking. So long as you keep looking for formal Kabbalah and formal halacha, you don't see it. But to create a functional society in which it was functional and it worked, there had to be a woman's role. There had to be, and therefore, whether you think going back to Eastern Europe, there are lots and lots of female um, about some form of Ballet Shem, some form of whisperers, some woman you went to when you were pregnant who will now, write the talisman and amulets for safe pregnancy. There were all sorts of practices for healing the sick that were out there that were practiced by women. And we tend to look, oh, um, the maid of Ludmilla because she acted like a man. No, you have to really look at the sort of folk literature and the books of the Bali Shem, and you'll see this huge realm of the ordinary household woman that there would be someone in each town who would have, or several, who would have these functions, who would take you to the graves, for example, and actually lead the prayers with you because literacy was not that high. You
Mm,
couldn't read a book
mm.
of Tina's. So someone who was the female prayer leader, we certainly know from synagogues, because if you couldn't read a high holidays machzor, you needed some woman who's going to tell you, who's going to be reciting what she thought you should be saying
Right.
and telling you when to stand, when to sit, when to do everything. Same thing with going to a grave. There were women who, here are the things
Like
you
a
say at the
Zogger.
grave. What?
Like a Zogerke, right? Was
Yeah, then you had to have somebody who was going to tell you what to do. You couldn't buy the book and
mm,
then do it yourself.
got it.
So they have an unsung role that nobody's really, we're just at the beginning stages of looking, how to see them in the margins.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And it's actually an exciting time, although it's frustrating, that there's not as much material as one would want. There's actually more than one would think if you
There
start.
is, there is more than one would think, and it would take somebody younger who wants to sit out and go through endless hagiography and endless sacred narratives and endless Hasidic stories and really cull out
Wonder.
um, these social roles.
Yeah.
The founders of the study of Hasidism, like Dinor, were much more interested in the social roles of proto-socialism, of community economics, of rebelling against um, the capitalist leaders of society, and that's what they called out. They weren't looking for this when they went through the material.
Right. Right. And so, but we are, so, we can take it in a different direction. Yeah. Wow. Um, Say something, please, about the Ballet Shem, because not everybody who's listening may know about that. And I remember you speaking about how every village, had a Rav and a Baal Shem, right? A
Okay,
rabbi and a master of.
so let me stop you for you.
Yeah.
Every okay, so the situation that it worked is not village. We paint this nostalgic view, but there's first of all a difference between the rabbi and a Mara de Astra.
Mm,
A rabbi was the rabbi in your village who had to check the chickens. I mean, had to do basic in front of you. And
mm,
the Mara de Astra, the master of that realm, had several villages all under him, and he made the decisions for the big issues like Eruv, Mikvah, and what's the standards. So
hmm.
if you do somebody like Rav Levi of Berditchev, the Hasidic leader, he was also a Mara de Atra who had the entire Polish estate, even though there were many other little rabbis who were in the area, they all independently in the town.
Mm,
But every place that you had a major rabbi at the end of the 18th century, you also had an Obed Hashem, somebody who was the God server, the spiritualist, the um person who gave the spiritual homilies. So, for example, people don't realize that someone like the Vilna Gaon, the Lever Elijah of Vilna, the Misnagid figure, was not the rabbi of Vilna. He was the Oved Hashem. He was the God server and spent all his time doing Kabbalah. Every town had a different person.
wow.
Now, when we come into the 18th century, they had all different views. Some of them are proto Hasidic, some of them are proto Misnagid, some of them are going to be rationalists. Some of them are still somewhat Sabbatian. Some of them there'll be all sorts of things because as a lone figure, you can get up and say whatever you wanted if you had that position, because rabbis did not give homilies, did not give sermons except twice a year,
Hmm.
only before uh, the Sabbath of repentance and the Sabbath before Passover.
Wow.
All the speaking every week was by the God server.
Wow.
And so all the books of Drashot are the person who had that role.
And
And
did
that
that?
became fertile
Mm,
because that became fertile for then saying that there will be this people in the places that um, give will be giving the sermons, giving rebuke, motivating you spiritually, leading revivals. And so therefore both Hasidism and the Misnagid anti-rationalism are all coming of that same cloth that you had these God servers in addition to the rabbi. The rabbi had to spend all their time doing law. Somebody else had to specialize in the spiritual texts.
amazing. This is it. It really kind of explodes. I think what some of our picture is of right of what this all looked like. Was the person who was the Oved Hashem, right, the God server, as you say, was that person ordained as a rabbi or not necessarily?
That's actually a good question. I never thought about it completely. Um, were they ordained as a, that is a good question. Um, because understand that a lot of the community, the difference between a major rabbi, the Mara the Asra, who is a great rabbinic figure for history, versus the little town rabbis who may have been in a ninth, 10th grade high school level,
Hmm.
the gap was so large. So it's really hard to say that someone who could spend their time with the Jewish books certainly was going to be called rabbi, but um, there were different levels, there were different types of ordination.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I mean, even to this day, there are different types of ordination.
Right.
I mean, to put it, you had quote unquote the ordination to teach, the ordination to decide the laws of kashrut, and the ordination to be a dayan, to be a rabbinic judge.
Mm-hmm.
Know that almost all the Chabad emissaries are called rabbi, but they're really not much more than ordination to teach.
Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah.
You've met a lot of these figures. There's not going to be much more of a difference there when people who are very good at doing outreach. And that's what, okay, you've studied enough, you're a rabbi. You know you're never going to become the official town rabbi.
Got it. And let's say I wanted an amulet for something. Would the Ovid Hashem be the person I would go to? Or would there
Sometimes yes, sometimes it will be somebody else in the community.
mm-hmm.
The same thing we can look in, different places. I mean, you'll have great figures like Rabbi Yaakov Emden writing amulets. You look at the um, world of the pan-Sephardic world today, and sometimes it will be a synagogue assistant or a shamash or a Torah reader who's writing the amulets in town, making extra money, and
Mm.
sometimes it'll be the rabbi. I don't think we've ever really looked at who's really writing them in a given town,
Wow.
but I think it's much more diverse because you have to have an interest to do it. I
Mm.
think a lot of cases will also be done by the stoker, the scribe,
Oh.
because they already have the deerskin cloth, they already have the parchment, they already have the pens to write it, and um, they know it. So when you think about leadership, I know you like thinking about rabbis and Hasidim. Understand the scribes are their own separate world altogether.
Huh. Huh.
Since since antiquity, they are their own world who can, like I said, write amulets.
Mm. Yeah. It it's really fascinating, right? There's really so many different kinds of religious practitioners, who are contributing to the community.
Yeah.
It's really something. Before we move on, will you say just something brief about Hasidim versus Mitnagdim, so folks who may not be familiar with those terms, right? You talked about how this is an ongoing debate or difficult, a disagreement, among the community in this time period that we're talking about, right? The 18th, 19th century.
So the standard story people tell, I'm going to revise it in a second.
Mm,
The standard story people tell is 18th century spirituality broke into two groups. One of them centered around the new Hasidic movement that found God in all things, that emphasized enthusiasm and ecstasy, and broke off from the main synagogue system to form little prayer houses, while the anti movement had to do with the personality of the Vilna Gaon, Elijah of Vilna, and his students, emphasizing the study of Torah, emphasizing the coming to be of the yeshiva in 1804, emphasizing that it's all about correct performance and correct study. In actuality, it's less simple. At one level, you can't tell people apart without a scorecard. You will have misnagdim who sound completely Hasidic because they're all coming from the same world. You'll have, now we know from the legend was filled with people who had a Chabad inclination or Hasidic inclination. We will have many Hasidic figures that will serve as rabbis, and it sounds a lot closer. It's not the simple story that we tell when you look at the micro level. On the macro level, it was certainly true, and then therefore the opponents of Hasidism put a ban on Hasidism as a invalid movement. And then, but those weren't actually misnagdim. Those were people from the rabbinic establishment. And but then over time, by the mid 19th century, it really faded away, except on the social level that people will joke, I'm from this family or from that family, or whether what customs you have. And we tend to leave out the role of just the ordinary rabbinate that continued, that it was neither either group when we talk about these things, or that were rationalists.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I
And
mean,
the
if you
rationalists would have been not,
what?
then the rationalists would not have been engaging in what we would call the mystical practice. Is
Nor
that?
would they have been a Misnagid, because the Vilna Gaon, I mean, of the books he put out, the majority were Kabbalah.
Mm,
Nor would a rationalist think you have to be learning 24 hours, because that's a mystical idea of living for the other world. So
mm,
that's why I get very cranky. You go to a town in Poland, if you visit like Zamość, court town, but it was entirely 95% rationalists. And then
mm.
the birthplace of Rosa Luxemburg and many Zionists. It was a rabbinic town. And when you go there, because of the tourist board, they have all these painted Hasidim all over the place, as if any Hasidim really lived in this town.
Wow.
It was the most rational and anti-Hasidic, anti-spirituality town. It was a rational business town, and we leave that out of our discussion. Like I said, when you go there, it's all about these dancing Hasidim on the walls of the tourist center,
Wow.
uh,
That's
rather than what the people really looked like.
it sounds a little bit like a distortion of history.
Yes.
So let me ask you in a different direction for a moment. You've done so much studying of Hinduism. And but before we wind to our close, I'd love for you to say something about what have you learned about Judaism from studying Hinduism, and now I know you're also working on Catholicism. So I'm really curious about how have these interfaith encounters, informed your understanding of Jewish mystical practice or Jewish practice in
So,
general.
um, so first of all, I found Hinduism exciting when you don't make it exotic and other, but you try to understand it in Jewish terms. You know, where does this fit in? And understand, for example, I taught in Varanasi and I taught at the Benares Hindu University, and all my colleagues were the equivalent of Misnagdim. They even were somewhat skeptical about the divine altogether. They had people who were incredibly strict legally, but we don't talk about the divine. Like, don't make this romantic image that India is all mysticism or anything else. These universities are engineering students. They're the people who are now CEOs of American corporations. Don't romanticize the country. So I learned you can really understand where things fit in, how how it comes to be. And that was the first part. In terms of the broader trends, when you get beyond the immediate parallels, law to law, mysticism to mysticism, ritual hand washing to ritual hand washing, or those things, the biggest change in my thinking was actually the role of sight, darshan.
Hmm.
And that because we downplay the role of sight within Judaism. Um, there is what's it, Professor Nace out in Michigan has a great book on the role of sight in Judaism. But
Site
it
is
really,
kind of site.
well, because for example, there's a midrash that says at Har Sinai, at the Mount Sinai, every Israelite saw an icon of God according to their own perception. The fact that God is now an omniperception, infinite being is in midrash. Or the fact that when you made pilgrimage, God saw us and we saw God. The role of sight is everywhere. Or Yehuda Halevi in the Kuzarei saying when you pray the Amidah, when it says, and the Shekhinah will return to Zion, he says you should visualize the Shekhinah at that point.
Hmm.
The Zohar is a tradition. If the Talmud is coming here, the Zohar is a tradition of come and see. And it's filled with visions. Stafford is filled with visions. And then we come back in the 20th century, and Rabbi Abraham Isaac Cook and Rav Kalanis Kalman Shapiro Piseta both emphasize the role of vision and seeing and visualization. Hinduism allowed me to understand sight and visualization in a way that modern Jewry really left it out. The 19th, early 20th century Jewish thinkers said paganism is sight, Judaism is hearing and talking, but then that's actually not true. You open up Midrash, Halevi, Zohar, Safed. It's filled with visions, picturing, envisionings. Um, and that was like the real biggest change to understand what role that plays in Judaism. Because once you're then looking for it, you don't, when you're reading the Zohar, it doesn't sort of just come and see. No, come and see. It is a visual tradition.
Yeah.
That's one of the, like I said, the biggest changes. Another change was, okay, so I'm teaching a class, graduate class, half Hindus, half Buddhists. They're doing a master's in religion. And for once again, for them, Judaism was exotic. Where we would think Buddhist meditation is exotic, they thought Judaism was exotic. So I'm going through a survey of Judaism. And when I taught Maimonides, the class all said, oh, the God of the perplexed is yoga. Why? Because it takes you from falsehood to truth by a process of the correct understanding. It's a correct discipline of getting from point A to point B. And this is what our yoga texts do. On the other hand, when I did Hasidism, they said, oh, yes, this is bhakti. You can go down into, the temple courtyard, and this is exactly what all the singers and dancers are thinking, the early Hasidic texts. That sort of framework will last me for life to see it through somebody else's eyes.
That's awesome. I think that is going to inform my world for a while. That's fascinating that they
Um,
that comparison.
yeah.
Wow. Wow. Thank you for sharing that. That's very cool. And it makes me feel like Maimonides and the Hasidim are not so at odds.
Right. Well, people tend to call, somebody who's just plain rationalist and would rather just watch TV and not think about spirituality, they'll call themselves a rational Maimonidean or they'll call themselves a Misnagid, but it has nothing to do with the actual movements.
Interesting. You spoke about sight, and this was a thing that really informed me when I was working on Sefer Yetzirah, because so much of what the book is doing is inviting visualization. And so, actually paying attention to that made me read the book differently. And
Right.
so, yeah.
And we've never translated the commentary on Sefer Yetzirah of Yosef and Shalom Ashkenazi, which is filled with all sorts of biological, natural extensions of the book.
Oh, interesting. I
It's one of those desideratums that it's never been looked at. I mean, it's been looked at, but it's never been developed to go further.
well, maybe I'll go look. That sounds
Maybe,
actually pretty
maybe,
great.
but once again, part of it, the opening up Sefer Yetzirah is know that already Stadia and others did what they did to Sefer Yetzirah. They weren't boxed in.
Right.
You then, look at Aryeh Kaplan even further. He doesn't feel boxed in
Right.
by trying to reproduce late antiquity.
Right. Right.
And that's all of our Hindu and Buddhist contemporary spirituality. Anybody who does anything yogic or vipassana, it's all because somebody modernized an old text. Nothing in the 10th, 13th, or 17th century sounds like the contemporary Hindu and Buddhist practices.
Wow. It's a great legitimization of sort of being in the now, in response to this tradition.
Yeah.
And that feels really important to me. So I guess my final question for you would be, as you were doing, your scholarly and teaching work, what's your vision for sort of a contemporary Jewish or larger spiritual practice? Like what world are you hoping to support?
So my long-term dream that I'm not going to be the one to do it is that we start opening up Jewish ashrams. It's not going to be for the majority of the Jewish community, the people who want nothing to do with it. But the same way these traditions started ashrams as modern transcultural institutes where you went and you did nothing but spirituality, nothing but communing, nothing but meditating, nothing but studying text about the divine, to create that equivalent that our Jewish spiritual seekers could have several institutes like that to go off like an ashram and to be part of it, to drift in and out of it, to come back to it, and to really be part of the community. Know that the ashram culture in India is only barely affects 4 or 5% of India. The majority of India is actually very ordinary theists who are really much more devotional. But that we really that ability, I sit there and talk to people, so I can sit there and talk into a section in ashram. You sit there in the front rooms and you say, "Oh, here's somebody who came in from Mumbai." Oh, he says, "Well, I come every once a year for 10 days to recharge or
Huh.
something." And to really create something like that, not just as um, there's something about the way American economics works that we've watched how the genealogy of how Eilat Chaim became this and then became that and then became this and then merged with Chazon and all this sort of like financials. In some way, there has to be some Jewish ashram that will teach nothing but God, God, nothing but merging into the divine, nothing but Devekus and his lavos. That's really my vision, that we could create some sustaining institute like that, that can be self-sufficient economically, that is not run like an adult education program.
Yeah, I love your vision. I would totally go sit there.
Um, right, because there are a dozen places like that in Rishikesh or Haridwar or Bangalore. There has the ability to have that something like that and to keep it going.
Mm, mm. It feels like a vision to work toward. It actually feels like a particular challenge to me and other of my colleagues for whom this is an important and undertaking to give people a place to steepen in this material.
And we watch, it's not just the Jewish ones have gone, a lot of even the Buddhist ones in America have had to go very corporate adult ed, you know, turned into a lifestyle thing you add to a corporate life rather than some places that really like a traditional ashram.
Yeah. I'm going to sit with that vision. It feels really powerful to me. Alan, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
This has been an incredible hour. I've really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you for sharing your teachings and your thoughts.
Anytime, anytime.
Right. So I wish you a good Shabbat and a good Purim, and
Thank you.
and
Okay, bye
bye.
bye.